Today's stuff we're going to be learning is Kiddushin Daf Nun Aleph. There's a study guide today that organizes the structure. It's actually a pretty clear structure, though the content is not so simple, as we've seen in the last number of dafim. Okay, we'll get started quickly. So the Mishnah starts off with this case of a man who betroths a woman and her sister, or a woman and her mother. And the Mishnah says that if he does it at the same time, it doesn't work. So our question is going to be, where do we get this from? So the Gemara asks Menahanan. I'm a Rami bar Hama. We're going to have two explanations. One is a little bit built on the first, but let's start here. To Amar Kra, the pasuk says, we're at the bottom of Nun Amud Bet. Isha lachota lo tikach litzro. Okay, the continuation is legalot ervata aleha bechayeha. That means the simple reading is you cannot marry a woman and her sister. Okay, which we usually assume that means if you marry one woman, you can't marry her sister, even if you divorce her. Even right. The only thing is because the pasuk says bechayeha. If she were to die, then you actually could marry the sister. But now he says the following. Let's understand it a little bit differently. Notice the word lo tikach. Lo tikach usually means, right? Here it means you can't marry her if you want, right? You can't marry the sister or have relations with her. But the way he's going to darshan is a little bit different. HaTorah amra b'sha'a shena'asu tzarot zo lazo, litzro, what is litzro? From the lashon of tzarot. If they become second co-wives, rival wives to each other, meaning if you marry both of them at the same time, lo yikach doesn't mean you can't do it, meaning it's forbidden. Lo yikach means lo yehelo likuchin afilu be'echad mehem. It won't even be effective. Okay, there will be no betrothal. The betrothal, remember, ki yikach is the way we saw betrothal, right? Lo yikach is there won't be betrothal. If you marry them both at the same time and they become rival wives, there is no such thing. It doesn't work. To which Rava says to him, wait a minute, I'm really Rava. Something doesn't jive in these psukim. If you're going to understand the pasuk means basically if you take two wives at the same time, betroth them both, there won't be Kiddushin at all. Well then, what's the problem? Well, the problem is that at the end of that section, it's all in Sefer Vayikra, chapter 18, it says, if you do any of these arayot that we listed, you will get karet, cut off from the people, right? Which means all sorts of things, right? We're not exactly sure what it means, but early death or something like that. So in any case, he says, if you betroth these two women and it's totally ineffective, well then how could you possibly get karet if you're not actually considered betrothed to them? Then you haven't done anything wrong because actually the Kiddushin wasn't effective at all. It's like you did nothing. So you can't actually even get karet for doing this. So Ella Amar Rava, Rava says no. So therefore, it can't be that that's what the pasuk is referring to. The pasuk is clearly referring to the way we understood the simple reading of the pasuk, which is, if you marry a woman, you are now forbidden to marry her sister. That was the simple reading. But he says, so kra b'zeh harsa umatnitin k'derabba. Now let's just pay attention to who's who. Rava goes against Rami bar Hama's explanation. Rami bar Hama tried to learn it from this pasuk. Rava says you can learn it from the pasuk, but in the following manner. The pasuk is not referring to where he betrothed them both at once. The pasuk is referring to where he betrothed them one after the other. But then kicks in Rabba's principle. What is Rabba's principle? And we're going to spend the first half of today's daf talking about this principle. If there's something that won't be effective if you do one after the other, meaning you married a woman, then, or a man marries a woman, then he marries her sister. Kiddushin, we learned this many times. If there's Isur Karet, Kiddushin and Kiddushin Tofsim, right? There will be no Kiddushin there, and that's based on the pasuk. Since you can't do it, it's Isur Erba, and you're going to get Karet for it. So if you do it, it's actually ineffectual. What does that mean? We've been seeing this all over. It means that if that woman who you betrothed after being betrothed to her sister, you now betroth her. She now wants to marry somebody else, right? You're not married to her. She wants to go marry someone else. She can go marry them. She doesn't need to get from you because there's no Kiddushin. It was a useless thing that you did. It was meaningless, had no effect whatsoever. So that's Eino B'zeh Charza. That we learn from the pasuk. Well, if it's going to be ineffectual, one after the other, again, the first one will be effective. The second one will not be. Well, then, if you do them bevat echat, like our Mishnah, it won't work at all. Okay? So since it won't work b'zeh charzeh, if you do them at the same time, it also won't be effective. That's Rava's principle. So Rava says against Rami bar Hama, you can't say the pasuk means bevat echat. The pasuk must mean one after the other. And then we're going to say, since it doesn't work one after the other from the pasuk, apply Rabba's principle, which is if it doesn't work one after the other, then it doesn't work at the same time. Well, Etive, now we're going to say Gufa. So let's go into this principle that Rava quoted Rabba as having said. We're now going to bring three different sources or discussions about three different halachot entirely, that basically we're going to have a situation where something done after something else is ineffective. And yet, if you do them at the same time, we're going to see it is effective. So the first topic is maaser. Maaser is different from truma. Truma, there's a range of what I could take. Okay, I can give the coin a little more, a little less. Okay, 1/40th, 1/50th, 1/60th. Maaser is 1/10, and it has to be 1/10. If you take 2/10, okay, let's say I take 1/10 of maaser, and then I separate another 1/10 of maaser, it's ineffective. I've done nothing the second time because I already did maaser. So it's ineffective what I did the second time. But we're now going to see so theoretically, if I did them at the same time, I took 2/10 instead of 1/10 from my produce, what would you say? It's totally ineffective. But that's not what it says here. Okay, that's going to be the problem because bizarre hazeh, it clearly doesn't work the second time. But if I do them at the same time, it actually works. And that's going to go against this principle that Rabba just said. If you give more maaser than you're supposed to, okay, so you take 1/5 or 2/10, which is 1/5 instead of 1/10. Perotav metukanim, you fixed your pile. So your 80% that's left, okay, you've taken 20% of your produce instead of 10%. Let's talk in percentages instead of fractions. It's a little simpler to visualize. So now, or maybe, I don't know, I think it is. So you take 20% instead of 10%. And now your 80% that's left is good because you've taken maaser on them, okay, which shows, by the way, that's already a problem. That shows the taking of the maaser was effective. What's the problem here? Okay, now that's already the problem for us because what do you see here? It's effective what you did. It shouldn't have been effective, just like the two women are not betrothed if you betroth them at the same time. Likewise here, the two maasers taken at the same time shouldn't work. Because again, if you took 1/10, 10%, and then after you took another 10%, it wouldn't work. The second 10% would not be maaser. So therefore, it shouldn't work if you took them both at the same time. But yet it does work. There's a separate issue, which is masrotav mekul kalim. The 20% is problematic. Why? Because really only 10% is maaser. The other 10% is tevel. What is tevel? Untithed produce. Because since you took it as if it was maaser, but it's not maaser, right? One of the 10ths that you took, right? Or let's say there's 100 lemons. So 10 of the lemons are maaser. 10 of the lemons are not maaser at all. But they're also not fixed because they're not part of the 80% that you said, I'm taking maaser on the 80% basically, right? So you end up, they're not fixed. But now you don't know which of the 20 are the 10 that are maaser and which of the 20 are the 10 that are not maaser and that are actually tevel and that you haven't done anything to fix them yet, which means you can't eat them. So now we have a mixture of all of these together and we don't know what's what, and therefore everything's mekukal. It's a problem. Okay, it's all considered tevel. Now, but back to the first part, which is the perot are actually fixed, though, the 80%. Amai. So you should be able to say, look, if it doesn't work, then it doesn't work all at the same time. Amar le, to which the Gemara says, no, this is different. Okay, and that's what we're going to do with each case. We're going to say each case is unique, and because of its uniqueness, that's why this works. What does that mean? We'll see in a minute, but you can do half. Okay, we don't know yet what this means. We'll keep reading. It's known that if I say, I take out a whole bunch of grains of wheat. Okay, I take them out, and now I say half of each of the grains I took out is maaser. Okay, because let's say I took out too many, and what I want to say is half of each grain. It sounds like a crazy thing to say because how are you going to start separating them from each other? But I'm thinking of like a pill chopper. You know, you have like a wheat chopper. But anyway, you're allowed to do that. I can separate things out and say half of what I separated out, even half of each kernel, is maaser. Since I can do that, when I took this 20% out, what I was really saying is I know I only have to do 1/10. So only 1/10 of it, there's a possibility within maaser to look at each one as half. So maybe you took out 20 lemons, and what I meant to say was half of each of these lemons is maaser. And then, since that would be effective, Therefore, we do view it as if I really only took a tenth, and therefore the 80% is fine. The problem is that since I took out another extra tenth, that tenth is really not maaser, it's tevel, and therefore, right, that's not fixed. And now I have this problem with all of these being mixed up. But the point is, you could do it b'zeh charzeh because of this, okay? And therefore, it works. So it's not a good example to question us, to question Rava. Second question, this is the animal tithe. They would do is, right, we know this from, tell you where you see it, in Nitana Tokef, we say that God is ma'avir tzono tachat shivto, right, where he takes his stick and everybody walks one by one. That's how the sheep would walk out for the animal tithes, one by one, and you would count them. You would go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. When you got to the 10th, that one was your tithe, and then you would put that one aside, and then you would keep going, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. That would be your maaser, and so on. Now, you can't say that you could split the animals in half like you split the wheat in half. There's no such thing. So if you wanted to give that example, we haven't even brought up the problem yet, but we're going to say, if you want to say that, you can't say that. So this one's going to raise another problem, and we won't have the simple answer that we gave last time. So there's no such thing as cutting an animal in half. By the way, also the woman, it's the same thing. You can't say, I'm married to half the woman, right? There's no such thing. And yet it doesn't work b'zeh charzeh. What does that mean? Okay, it means that if I take the 10th animal and I say, okay, I'm counting and I get to number 10, and then I say number 11 is 10. It's not effective because I already said number 10 is 10. So 11 is not effective. Okay, it's not going to be sanctified. So that means leika b'zeh charzeh. If I say number 11 is number 10, it's not the animal tithe. Okay, it's just not. It's nothing. Right? It's just a regular animal of mine. So that means it's ineffective one after the other, just like the Kiddushin, sister and sister. The second sister is not betrothed. Hama and Raba, and what does Rava say though? Yatzu shnayim ba'asiri. Okay, we need a parallel case to the two sisters. He betrothed the two sisters at once. If two animals, instead of coming one by one, they both walked out at exactly the same time, and he says 10. And now we don't know which one did he count as the 10. So what's the halakha? Asiri va'achadasar me'urabim zeh bazeh. Now, what would you say? If you can't do it b'zeh charzeh, number 11, you called number 10, it wouldn't work, right? You said 10, and then you said 10 again. The second one would be totally ineffective. So therefore, when you do two at the same time, neither should be maaser, right? It should be totally ineffective according to Rabba's principle. But what do we say here? Asiri v'achadasar me'urabim zeh bazeh. Just like we said with the maaser. You have one is maaser behema, one is not, but we don't know which is which, so you have a problem, which means it's effective. So, right, it's effective for one of them, but we don't know which one. So you see it as effective. So again, the Gemara is going to say, no, maaser of the animals is different. Shane maaser behema di'ite b'taut. You could have a case of zeh charzeh, of a mistake, that it actually would be sanctified. And because of that, it's not a classic case of eino b'zeh charzeh. The two sisters can never be. You betroth one after the other, it's never going to be effective. But in maaser behema, there is a case. Okay, utitsnan, as it says in the Mishna. Okay, we're going to learn all this when we get to Bechorot. Bechorot talks about Bechor, and it talks about maaser behema. Titnan, right? Bechor there is Bechor of the animals. Haralat shi'i asiri, ula asiri shi'i, ula achadasar asiri. Some people get a little confused when they count. So if you're counting, and by accident, okay, what happens in this case, it's unique because you didn't call the 10th the 10th. If you call the 10th the 10th, and the 10th is the 10th, and the other ones aren't. But if you called the 9th the 10th by accident, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, then you realize you go back and then you call the 10th one 9, but then you get confused again because you said that's 9, so you automatically counted the 11th one is 10. Shloshtam Kiddushin. They're all sanctified, okay? They all have status, at least of safek maaser behema. Okay, I'm not going to get into what you do with each one of them, and that's a whole separate story. We'll get there when we get to Bechorah, not for today. But the point is, there is a way that b'zeh charzeh could be effective, and the Kedusha could work in some way. So therefore, it's not a classic case of eino b'zeh charzeh, because there is, if it's a mistake. Okay, third example, hare toda, Thanksgiving offering is brought with an animal, and when you also designate breads, okay, there's 40 loaves that you have to bring with a Thanksgiving offering. So now, a korban toda deleta b'taut, releta nami b'zeh charzeh. Now we're going to go back to the two previous ones. You can't say it's like the last one where by mistake it would work. We're going to talk about in a minute what we mean. And it doesn't work with Zeh. What are we talking about? You have to bring 40 loaves. So if you're slaughtering the animal, we can look at Rashi, Litnihu b'ta'ut, okay? It's where the lines are wide. In mine, it's the 6th or 7th line, but not always. It's the same in everyone's book. Rashi says, She'im shachat toda arba'im chalot. Okay, so while I'm slaughtering the animal, I have in mind that I'm sanctifying these 40 loaves that I have. But I have in mind that they're going to be black bread. And it turns out, I'm not going to read in Rashi, but Rashi says this, it turns out it was white bread that was there. So I had the wrong intent. So now this is a mistake. And lo kiddushin. We say this is not valid. Why not? So Rashi quotes that there's a Mishna in Nazir that we learned. What if you do hekdesh by mistake? Beit Shammai says it's actually effective. Beit Hillel says it's not. And we hold like Beit Hillel. So this mistake is ineffective. So that means none of these are sanctified. Okay? So that's number one. So it doesn't work as a mistake. It also doesn't work b'zeh harzeh. Okay, now also, if I sanctified 40, and then I sanctify another 40, the second 40 is not sanctified. Okay? So therefore, what are we going to assume now? What if I sanctify 80 at the same time? I say, I'm sanctifying 80 loaves. I'm only liable 40. I'm only supposed to bring 40. I'm obligated to bring 40. Now, if we say, well, it doesn't work with Zeh harzeh. If I sanctify 40 and I sanctify another 40, those 40 are not valid. And there's no way they're even valid in a mistake. By mistake, it doesn't work at all because hekdesh ta'ut, there is no such thing. So if it doesn't work with Zeh harzeh, and there's no way Zeh harzeh ever works, then they shouldn't work if I do it b'vat achat. So that's what we're going to see right now. Now, it says here, v'itmar, toda shenishcheta al 80 chalot. If while I'm slaughtering the animal or someone's slaughtering my animal, I have intent that I'm going to bring 80 loaves instead of 40. So what should happen? According to what we just said, if it doesn't work b'zeh harzeh, according to Rabba, it shouldn't work b'vat achat. Nothing should be sanctified. Well, Chizkiah Amar, 40 of those 80 are sanctified. So that goes against what Rabba's principle is. Well, Rabbi Yochanan Amar lo Rabbi Yochanan holds like Rabba, which is nothing is sanctified. But Rabbi Yochanan doesn't interest us because Chizkiah is the rabbi of Rabbi Yochanan, and therefore the Gemara thinks Rabba should work well with Chizkiah and not Rabbi Yochanan. To which the Gemara said, wait a minute. You didn't properly understand the machlokah Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan, and that's how we're going to resolve our issue. It's not what you think. Lav itmar la, was it not said about that machlokah Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan? Amar Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, or some people say it's Amar Rabbi Zera, whoever said it. Hakol mudim, they actually don't disagree about the following two cases, and they only disagree about a third case. So let's read. Hakol mudim kol hecha da'amar kad shelar ba'im mitoch shmonim kad. If you said, I'm sanctifying 40 out of this 80, it works because you're really saying I'm only sanctifying 40, even though you're not specifying exactly which 40. Lo yikadshu arba'im elim ken kadshe shmonim, if you say, those 40 are not going to be sanctified unless I can sanctify all 80, which is the way we thought they were arguing. Lo kadshe, everybody agrees it doesn't work because of our principle. If you can't do it b'zeh harzeh, then you can't do them all at once, which means we have no question anymore. So what is their machloka, just so we understand it? Lo nechleku ela b'stam. What happens is you didn't specify anything about what you meant when you said 80. You just said, I'm sanctifying 80 loaves. Now, the question is, this goes again into what were you thinking? So, Mar Savar, so Chizkiah and Rabbi Yochanan each have a different opinion about what we assume. Again, this is all assumptions about human behavior. What we assume you must have thought. Mar Savar la'achrayut kam rechaven. Chizkiah says this is effective, meaning 40 of them are sanctified and not all 80, because when you said 80, all you meant was, I want to have 40 waiting there just in case something happens to the first 40. What if they get disqualified in some way? That I want to make sure that my korban's going to go through and I have everything set. You're maybe a little crazy about having everything in place, and you want to make sure everything's right and everything's this, and you don't want to have a problem, right? Some people, worry too much, you could say. So you have an extra 40, and you say, I'm sanctifying all 80 so that I have 40 spare. And that's why it works, because you're not really sanctifying all 80. You're just sanctifying 40 and having 40 there for spare. Umar Savar, the korban gadol kamahav. But Rabbi Yochanan says, no, if you said 80, you obviously meant you wanted to bring 80 loaves with this, and there is no such thing, and that's why it doesn't work. So we had three questions against Rabba's principle. In the end, we reject all the questions because each one is unique and it's not, or we didn't really understand it the way it was meant to be understood. Now we go back to the beginning. Rami bar Hama brought a pasuk. Rava responded by saying, well, you misunderstood that pasuk. The pasuk really means the simple reading. But since it doesn't work with Zakharzeh, then we'll kick Rava's principle will kick in. And since it doesn't work with Zakharzeh, it also doesn't work with halakha. But now they ask a question about Rava. Rava, why did you have to explain the source for this halakha like Rava's principle? You had a much better explanation based on your whole theory of life, or theory of machloket here. Kiddushin she'em mesurin lebiyaninu. You hold, now there's a big machloket. We saw this before. We're going to see it again, and we're going to deal with it for the rest of today and part of tomorrow. And it's one of the famous machlokot between Abaye and Rava, called Ya'al Kegam, which are the Rashi Tevot, and the Kuf in Ya'al Kegam. The Kuf, the second word, the first letter is Kuf. Kiddushin she'em mesurin lebi'ah. Okay, Kiddushin that can't go through with consummating the marriage, basically. They cannot have relations. Okay, if a man betroths a woman in a situation where there's no way they can have relations, okay, mainly in our case, it's going to be because it's forbidden to them by Torah law, then it's not actually Kiddushin. The Kiddushin is ineffective according to Rava. Abaye thinks they're effective. What does it mean they're effective? Well, it means if she wants to go marry someone else, she has to get a divorce. If you say they're not effective, it means it's nothing. You did absolutely nothing. She can go marry anybody else she wants. She's not forbidden to anybody. Like Kiddushin usually forbids a woman to everyone else, except for the man that she's going to eventually marry. But if it's ineffective, then you don't need a get from that. So basically, we're going to say like this. If you betroth a woman and her sister at the same time, a man betroths a woman and her sister at the same time, what's going to happen? Well, he can't have relations with either one because each one he's betrothed to the sister of that one. So therefore, he can't have relations with anyone because he's not allowed to have relations with a woman and her sister. So each one, he can't complete the marriage, right? He can't consummate the marriage. He can't have relations with her. So that's a classic case of Kiddushin she'em mesurin lebi'ah. So therefore, why did Rava just say that? That's the reason for the Mishnah, because it's Kiddushin she'em mesurin lebi'ah. So the answer, Lidvarav Rami bar Hama kama. He was only responding to Rami bar Hama and saying, oh, you want to learn it from this pasuk? I'll show you how you can learn it from the pasuk, but not in the way that you did. But really, Rava could have said that himself. Now, since we mentioned this, Kiddushin she'em mesurin lebi'ah, we're now going to spend the rest of the day discussing this. Kiddushin she'em mesurin lebi'ah. Okay, I told you this, but we didn't know this until we're going to read it right now. Abaye amar havu Kiddushin, again, which means it doesn't mean they're married and can live happily ever after. No, you marry two women, a woman and her mother, or any kind of situation. We're going to see a whole bunch of them where there's no way you could have relations with them or one of them, whatever it might be. It could even be a case where you were married to a woman and then you got divorced and then you wanted to marry her sister, right? So that's Kiddushin shalonim siru lebi'ah. Okay, there's reasons anyway why you're not betrothed her, because in Kiddushin tovsim be'arayot. Here's a case where you married both of them at the same time, right? And theoretically, since each one, right, you're married to the other, if you betroth both at the same time, so again, it's Kiddushin she'em mesurin lebi'ah, because you can never end up with any one of them because you're betrothed to the other sister. So now, Abaye says this is Kiddushin, which means she needs a divorce if she wants to marry somebody else. Rava says, lo havu Kiddushin, this is totally ineffective. It's like doing nothing. Okay? I'm a Rava. So first we're going to have, Rava's going to give an explanation. Bar Hani Esbrali. I'm going to explain my approach, why I think that we don't get an explanation of Abaye, just of Rava. Bar Hani explained to me. Ki kach ish isha uve'ala Kiddushin mesurin lebi'ah havu Kiddushin. Kiddushin she'em mesurin lebi'ah lo havu Kiddushin. Because the pasuk about marriage in the Torah, which we've talked about a lot, and we actually saw this in the beginning of the Masechet, when it says ki kach ish isha, when a man betroths a woman, uve'ala, and he has relations with her. So here you see this inherent connection. If you can't do the end of that part, that phrase uve'ala, then the beginning part is not relevant either. So now, Tanan. We're now going to bring, we'll see if we get to all of them today, but we're going to bring 5 cases today and more tomorrow with questions from mishnayot on Rava. We're going to bring each time a Mishnah and say, this Mishnah doesn't seem to hold like Rava. Okay, remember Rava says, and this is why it's all charted on the sheet, it's easier to follow. Rava says it's not Kiddushin. Okay, Whereas Abaye says it is Kiddushin, and again, it's really the strict approach, which is you better get yourself a divorce if you want to get remarried. So T'nan, we're actually going to start with our Mishnah. Now, even though it seemed like our Mishnah was holding like Rava, because we said, why don't you just bring the source for our Mishnah is Kiddushin Shein L'Suin L'Biyah, because you're with two women. But we're now going to make an inference from our Mishnah, which is actually going to see the opposite, which is T'nan, HaMekadesh Isha L'Bita L'Isha B'Achota Ke'echad Inam Kudashot. So if you betroth them both at the same time, they're not betrothed. But here you can infer what? What if you did Echat Mi'isha L'Bita or Mi'isha B'Achota? You would be Mekudeshet. If the Mishnah says if you did both at the same time, it wouldn't work. What if you said, I'm betrothing one of the sisters, but you didn't say which one? Now, each sister is possibly the one you're betrothed to, which means that each sister can have relations with him because it's possible that he's not betrothed to her, but betrothed to the sister. And therefore, she's not allowed to have relations with him. So you would say, according to, if you're Rava, you would say, Kiddushin she'en Misurin l'biyah, lo hava Kiddushin. It wouldn't be effective. But since the Mishnah only talked about a case where he betrothed both of them, we can assume that if he betrothed only one of them, just didn't specify which one, again, it's an inference. Whether or not you infer this or not is the question. But right now they're going to infer, Hamisha or Hamisha b'achota, you would be Mekudeshet v'amayim. Why would that work? Kiddushin she'en Misurin l'biyah ninhu and tiyufta de Rava. So this inference would imply that Rava's not right. Amar l'cha Rav. So now Rava could answer. Now, Rava's not there to answer. This question was asked later. But Gemara puts words in his mouth and says, wait a minute. According to what you're saying, I'm going to raise a question on Abaye from the second part of the Mishnah. Do you want to bring this Mishnah to question me? I'll bring you a question from the second part against the other approach. Which basically means the second part supports me. מעשה בחמש נשים ובהן שתי אחיות ולקט אחד כלכלה של תאנים ושלהן הייתה ושל שביעית הייתה ואמר הרי כולכם מקודשות לי בכלכלה זו ואמרו חכמים אין אחיות מקודשות. That's just a review of the sefer of the Mishnah we saw yesterday. There was a case where a man betrothed 5 women, very strange case, and there were 2 sisters among those 5 women. He took this basket of fruits, of figs that belonged to them. It was growing from their field, but it was the Shemitah year, so everything was ownerless. He took rights to it. He said, it's mine. He gives it to one of them. She takes it, accepts it on behalf of all the other women. What do we say? All the other women are betrothed, but not the 2 sisters. Now, why not? This is, right? Now, the question is, what's the case here? So first, and why is this support Rava? We want to say, right, Kiddushim Shalom Sirim Libya are not Kiddushim. So now it says the following. First of all, note, which is obvious. So first of all, the 2 sisters are not, but the 3 other women are betrothed to him. Now, so what's the case? He brings up a separate problem that we didn't think about when we read the Mishnah, which is, if he really said like the simple reading of the Mishnah, because it actually says, he says, kulchem mekudashot li, okay? If he said all of you, as if it's one statement, it's actually a subject of debate in Baba Batra whether this works. But if I say to you, you and your donkey will acquire my house, okay? According to one of the opinions, it's not effective because a donkey can't acquire. So if I include you with the donkey in my statement, you and the donkey acquire, that won't work. So he said, you, all of you, and included in one statement, the women who could be acquired and the women who couldn't be acquired, the 2 sisters, then it wouldn't even work for the women who could be acquired and they wouldn't be. And we just inferred from the Mishnah, the way we understood the Mishnah, which seems like the simple reading, which is the 3 other women are betrothed. So it's only the 2 sisters that are not. So therefore it can't be that he said, kulchem. Moving now to Amubet. Elalav, it must be, and this is going to raise the question on Rava, de amar lehu echat miken. It must be that he said, and now you just have to add a word, the commentaries say this, kulchem, all of you, meaning all 3 of you, and one of the 2 sisters. That's what they're assuming he said. Now, if that's the case, what did we just say? The katane, the Mishnah says, ein achayot mekudashot. The sisters are not betrothed. Now, this is a case of one of them, and Rava says, look, that proves my point. Because I think, remember, you inferred from the Reisha, one of them would work, I'm going to infer from the Sefer that one of them wouldn't work. Why wouldn't it work? Because it's Kiddushin she'em isurim l'biyah, Kiddushin shalom isurim l'biyah, because we don't know which one he was betrothing, and therefore each one is forbidden to him out of a doubt. Therefore, there's no Kiddushin. So that proves my point. So therefore, they say the following. The Rava kasha reisha, Abaye kasha sefer. So we started this as a difficulty with Rava, but we now said our Mishnah, the reisha and the inference from the reisha is a problem with Rava. The sefer, and the way we understood the sefer right now, is a problem for Abaye. So how are we going to resolve this according to each of them? So this is why there's a chart within a chart on the page, which is how to resolve the reisha and the sefer. So Abaye mitaretz l'tame. If you remember, the reisha was a problem to Abaye. Okay, so how's he going to explain? Sorry, I just said it wrong. The sefer was a problem to Abaye, what we just explained, because it sounds like one of the two won't be Kiddushin, and he says it would be Kiddushin if it's one of the two. So how's Abaye going to explain? That actually works for him, because again, what's the inference? Or would be mikudeshet. If it's one of two and it's a safek, right, then it would be, because that's Kiddushin, shalonim seru l'biyah, and he thinks it would be Kiddushin. V'imama, now he would have to add the following. But if you said ha're'uya l'biyah titkadesh li, and mikudeshet, only if you added the word saying, only if you're re'uya l'biyah, only if I can have relations with you will you be mikudeshet, then they won't be, because neither one is actually able to have relations with him, because maybe their sister is the one who was betrothed and not them. Now, how's he going to explain the sefer? This is the problem. Well, we're going to add this element of him having added these words, haruya l'biyah. Right now, we're just quoting the case. There were 5 women and 2 sisters among them. He took this basket of figs, and now we change the words a little. And instead of saying kulchem, he said, anyone who is re'uya, anyone I can have relations with, will be betrothed to me. And then, because they can't have relations with him. All this does is it adds in those words, which means if he didn't say those words, then we don't care about re'uya l'biyah. No matter what, they're going to be betrothed to him. Again, all it means is we're going to be strict and require them to get a divorce from him, or require him to give a divorce to them, to give a get to them. But if he actually, when he goes out and specifies, I'm only betrothing the ones who I can actually have relations with, then it's a different story. But what you have to do is you have to say the Mishnah is talking about what we do in Ukimta, a particular situation. But if that wasn't stated, then that wouldn't be the case. So that was how Abaye is going to read the Mishnah. Now we have to go back to Rava. And remember, Rava, the problem was the inference from the beginning. The inference was because Isha v'achota at the same time would be, right, is not mikudeshet. But if you did one of the two, you just didn't say which one, it actually sounds like it would be. So Rava mitaretz l'tame, he's going to explain it like this. Hamikadesh echad mi'isha u'bita, or echad mi'isha v'achota, if you do one of a mother, or a wife and a woman and her daughter, or one of a woman and her sister, na'asa kemisha kidesh isha u'bita u'isha v'achota ke'echad, ve'inam mukdashot. He basically reads the Mishnah differently. I mean, they each have to read it differently, otherwise it doesn't work to their opinion. So he reads this part differently, the reisha. He says, it actually really is referring to a case of one of two. And what he's saying is one of two would be just like 2 at the same time. Okay. And then it's not 2 at the same time doesn't work, or both at the same time doesn't work, but one of the 2 would. No, one of the 2 is like 2 at the same time. And then Maaseh Nami, and now the Gemara is going to prove this from the Maaseh. He changes the second one also. He says the second case is actually a case of the 3 of you, all of you, or is the 3 of you, and one of the 2 sisters. And then what is his whole thing is that Amaru Chachamim and achayot mekudashot, and the sisters aren't, because one of 2 doesn't work, because the classic Kiddushin she'en isurim l'biyah einam Kiddushin, they're not Kiddushin at all. Okay, this is a very confusing type of, because we've now read the Mishnah in 2 totally different manners in order to make it fit with Rava and Abaye. So that was question number 1. Difficulty number 2 against Rava. So difficulty number 1, he succeeded in throwing the difficulty back on Abaye. Again, it wasn't him, but it was the Gemara in his name. But again, all issues were resolved. Tashma, next source, a Mishnah later on in Kiddushin. Hamikadeshet bitostam. A father betroths his daughter. He says, I'm betrothing my daughter, but he didn't mention which daughter. Now, since fathers generally betroth their younger daughters, right? And they can't betroth their older daughters, unless we'll see in what case. But normally, remember what we learned, if she's a bogeret, she already leaves her father's domain and he can't betroth her. So, ein habagrot bichla. So basically, our doubts about which daughter was betrothed is all the younger daughters, but not the older daughters. We can assume it was only the younger daughters. Now, if you say that, it sounds like haktanot bichlal. All it said in the Mishnah was the older daughters are not part of the doubt here. Because again, what's the problem? If you're engaged, betrothed, in doubt, you and a bunch of your sisters, then no one, right? It's again, Kiddushin shalonim siru libiyah. None of them can end up having relations with him because maybe he's betrothed to a sister of hers and it would be a problem. But it seems to be a problem only for and basically we're removing from that whole problem the older daughters. But it sounds like all the younger daughters are problematic, meaning sounds like the ktanot are betrothed misafek, which would mean they each need a divorce from him. V'amai, kiddushin she'en mesurin libianinu v'tiyuvta derava. This should be a classic case of kiddushin that he can't end up having relations with them because maybe he's married to the sister, and therefore, with each one, it's a safek, and it should not even be kiddushin. So amar lecha Rava, hacha b'mayaskinan k'she'en sham ela gdola v'ktana. What did it mean? It meant that if there's one daughter who's older, one daughter who's younger, and he said, I'm betrothing my daughter to you, he obviously meant the younger daughter and not the older daughter. And then this has nothing to do with a suffix situation. It's very clear if a father was going to have to choose when he said my daughter, did he mean the one who's already out of his realm of responsibility or still under his responsibility to betroth? Obviously, it's the one who was the minor. But then the Gemara says, how can you possibly say there was only one older and one younger? It says, ha bogrot katani. It says the older ones, as if there were older ones, and younger ones, as if there were many. To which I say, no, my bogrot alma. It means any man who does this, anyone who has older daughters, an older daughter, they're not part of it. But it didn't mean necessarily that in this case, there were multiple older daughters and therefore also multiple younger daughters. So now they say, okay, well, if that's the case, there's one older daughter and one younger daughter, and he said, my daughter's betrothed, and we say it goes to the younger one, well, then why is the Mishnah telling us this? Wouldn't you be able to figure this out on your own? If a father betroths his younger daughters, he doesn't betroth his older daughters. Obviously, if he said my daughter and you only have one daughter, obviously he meant the younger one and not the older one. So there's no reason for the Mishnah to tell us something that's totally obvious. To which the answer, I said we'd see a case where it could be he's betrothing the older daughter. It's a case where the older daughter asked him to accept betrothal on her behalf. Now, this sugya is going to ignore what Lavan said, which is, Lo yasekem bimkomenu lateta tzira lifnei bechira. There's no way we would betroth the younger one before the older one gets married. In this case, we're going to say if he has an older daughter who's not married, and he has a younger daughter who's not married, and the older daughter sent him to go get a betrothal for her. She made him her shaliach. And he has the younger daughter also to marry off. He's clearly going to take care of the younger daughter first. Now, why would that be? So, Ma'u detema, you might have thought, because she made him a shaliach, that when he accepted the Kiddushin, maybe it was on behalf of the older daughter, and that's why the Mishnah has to tell you, Kamash Malan, no. Why do we assume he did the younger daughter? Because we make a certain assumption about human behavior. Lo shavit inish midi de ilay hana amine. Who gets the kesef Kiddushin? If she's the older daughter, she gets it. If it's the younger daughter, he gets it. So he's obviously going to do something that's in his own best interest, which is he's going to get the money of the Kiddushin of the younger daughter. So he's obviously going to do something where he gets the money rather than, so if he has a choice, younger daughter, older daughter, he's going to go with the younger daughter. That's why I said this ignores the fact that, he wants to get his older daughter married first, which you might have thought. Now, of course, it's Lavan who says that, but, you could say that was societal norms. Anyway, the Gemara is going to say, wait, that's not a good answer. Milo askina da amrile kiddushe l'didach. What if, okay, she said, you can keep the money of the Kiddushin. Please be my messenger, and you can keep the money. Is the halakha going to change? No, it seems like still it would be the younger daughter. How do we know? Because if it depended on the money, it would have said so. Okay, so since it doesn't distinguish between whether she kept the money or she offered him to keep the money, therefore it's not clearly the money issue. That's not the thing. So what do they say? Well, I'll still explain it why the younger. And again, then this has nothing to do with our case because there's no suffix about a bunch of younger sisters. There was only one, and therefore it's obvious it's her. Why is it obvious it's her, even if the older daughter made him a shaliach? A father is responsible to marry off his younger daughter. He has a mitzvah to do that. But he doesn't have a mitzvah to marry off his older daughter. It's her responsibility. Okay, there's a mitzvah. Rashi quotes that it says, "Ebnechem tidnu le'anashim," right? "Ebnotechem tidnu le'anashim" from Yirmiyahu. Okay, there's some pasuk where we learn it from that you're supposed to marry off your daughters, but you're only supposed to marry them off when they're young. So therefore, that's the one that the mitzvah is incumbent upon him, as opposed to the older daughter who asked him to be a messenger, but that's not a mitzvah incumbent upon him. So therefore, if you have a choice, you're going to choose the mitzvah that's incumbent upon you. Next source, Tashma. We're still continuing with questions on Rava. He has two groups he has two wives. Okay, one has two older girls and one has two younger girls. Okay, so let's say their ages are 18, 16, 14, 12. Okay, let's just say that to make things easy. So now he says, Amar Kida, and the 18 and the 16-year-old belong to the first wife, and the 14 and 12-year-old belong to the second wife. ואמר קידש יהיה ביתי הגדולה, ואיני יודע אם גדולה שבגדולות, אם גדולה שבקטנות, אם קטנה שבגדולות, שהיא גדולה מן הגדולה שבקטנות. Okay, it's all relative. So it either could be the oldest of the oldest, right, the 18-year-old. It could be the 14-year-old because she's the oldest of the second wife. It could be the 16-year-old because she's older than the two younger ones of the second wife. So he's not sure which one. Well, all three of those. The only one that's not forbidden to get married to anyone is the younger one, okay, because she's clearly the youngest. But all the others are safek mekudashot. Now, if you say Kiddushin she'en misurin libiyad, this is a case of safek. We don't know who he betrothed, which means he can't marry any one of the sisters, right? He can't have relations with any one of them because maybe one of them is the sister of the one he's betrothed to. So that would go against Rava, to which they answer, and this is going to be the answer for all the upcoming ones. It's not a case where he did a betrothal and he's not sure in the betrothal which one he meant. It's a case where at the time of the Kiddushin, let's say a week ago, he knew exactly which one he betrothed. So there was a definitive betrothal at the time of the betrothal. There was no safek, which then makes it not our case. At that time, let's say he took the 16-year-old, okay? He betrothed the 16-year-old daughter to this man, okay? Well, whatever. It's a father that betrothed, so she would have to be younger. So whatever, let's just ignore that right now. But let's say she didn't have simanim yet, okay? She's an underdeveloped 16-year-old. Now, if he betroths her, right? So this wasn't a good example because I took older ages. I just didn't want to take younger ages because it's so hard to imagine marriage like that. But maybe the better example would have been like, 12, 11, 10, 9, okay? Now, at the time he knew which daughter, but now he doesn't remember. So the Kiddushin was valid because it was a totally normal Kiddushin. It's just now we're not sure. So that's a different story. We're talking about when the Kiddushin itself had a doubt. We're saying now the doubt came after the Kiddushin. And in fact, you can prove it. It says, Eini yoda, I don't know which one I did. V'lo katani ein yadua. It's not that it's not known. Before we were talking about someone who betroths one of two potential women, right? I'm betrothing one of the sisters. Well, when you say that, it's a problem because you don't know which sister. Nobody knows which sister. But that would be ein yadua. It's not known. It was known, just he doesn't know anymore. He got confused. Shema mina. To which they say again, well, then what's the chiddush here? It's obvious then that she's betrothed, right? And then we have this suffix about all the others, and we don't know who's the one who's betrothed. Of course, they're all forbidden. It's obvious. Say, well, it's not so obvious. Rabbi Yossi had an opinion that said people would never put themselves in a suffix situation. So if at the time he said, I'm betrothing my older daughter, and later says, I remember I betrothed my older daughter, I just don't remember which one I meant. Rabbi Yossi says there's no way you would have said older daughter and not meant your oldest, because you would never put yourself into a situation where ultimately it will come out to be some sort of confusion. So when you said older, you must have meant the clearly older one, and it must have been the oldest. And therefore, that's what Rabbi Yossi says. But our Mishna is telling you, this opinion of this Mishnah thinks against Rabbi Yossi, that you would put yourself in that situation, and therefore there's a doubt about which one you actually married off, and therefore it's a problem. Tashma, next source. Misha Kidesh, we're now in Yevamo. Misha Kidesh achad mishtei achayot, ve'eni odeh eze Kidesh. This is exactly the case we talked about. One of two sisters. So again, if you're Rava, what are you going to say? In Kiddushin Tovtzim, because you can't marry either one of them. Well, what does it say here? No, tein get lizo, get lizo. You need to give a get to each one. That sounds exactly like Abaye. Kiddushin or Tovtzim, and now you have to just fix the problem. To which they say, oh no, hacha b'maya skinan. Again, kishu ukru levasof nitarvu. You betrothed one of them, okay, Yael and Tamar. So you betrothed Yael, you just don't remember the next day, was it Yael or Tamar that you betrothed? You remember it was one of the sisters, you just don't remember which one. So then the Kiddushin with Yael on day number 1 worked because it wasn't a suffix, it wasn't like you were potentially betrothed to her sister. It's just that a week later, you have no recollection of which one it was, and now you're in a suffix situation. So now you have to give a get to either one of them, but again, it has nothing to do with Kiddushin Shalom Nimsuru L'Biyah, because it was Nimsuru L'Biyah. It's just a problem now. Daikanami dekatani, again, we're going to infer this is going to be the exact same structure. Eino yodea, below katani eino yadua. Again, he says, I don't know, not it's not known, right? Well, then what's the question? Obviously, if he married one who was definitively betrothed to her, and now it becomes a question, which one was he betrothed to? Of course, he's going to need to give them each a get. Well, seifa yitzrichale. Actually, there's no chiddush here in the Mishnah. The Mishnah was only coming because of the development of that case, which was the next stage. It was just coming to build the structure. Here we get now to the second case. Umei velo achechad, classic Yibum case now. So he marries one. He doesn't know, or Kiddushin to one. He doesn't know which one. Now he dies, and they have no children. So now she's supposed to, right? But now we have we have 2 sisters who are supposed to do Yibum. What's the problem? Well, if he has one brother only, he has to do chalitza to both. Choletz l'shtehen. Why is that? The first one, maybe he's married, maybe he's supposed to, maybe the sister is the one who we call zikuka. If you remember, there's something called the chotzikukato. The sister of the one you're supposed to do yibum with, you can't marry. So we can't do yibum with the first one because maybe it's his sister and it's a problem. Once he does chalitza with her, you could say maybe he could do yibum with the second because he's already dealt with the yibum problem, right? The yibum issue with number 1. If it wasn't number 1, well, then he can marry number 2. If it was number 1, then he actually got rid of her and he can marry, right? He dealt with the Yibum problem. He now can marry the sister because he never married the first one. But what's the problem? The rabbi said you can't marry a chok chalutzato, just like you can't marry a sister of a woman who's the divorcee, who you divorced. You also can't marry the sister of a woman you did chalitza with, even though you were never actually married to her. It's a rabbinic decree. So because of that, he can't marry the second one either. So he has to do chalitza to both. But hayula shnayim, if he had 2 brothers, then echad choletz ve'echad miyaben. And let's just go on for one more minute. In kadmu v'kansu emotzino tamiyadam. But if they both went ahead and married these women, it's actually okay. You can leave it. We'll talk about this in a second. But I wanted to get to this last line, which is the order is very important, though. Davka michlatz v'hadra yibume, aval yibume v'hadra michlatz lo dekapagam ba'achot zikukatem. What does this mean? The first brother has to do chalitza. He can't do yibum because, again, the second one might be chayav in yibum with him. And then she's the sister. He's marrying the sister of the one who he's supposed to do yibum with. So the first one, he has to do chalitza. The second brother now, number 1, okay, either this was the one, and then he can do yibum with her, because the other one was nothing. And he didn't do chalitza with the other one. The other brother did. A chol chalitza, that was only a problem for that brother, not for the other brother. So if the second brother wants to go ahead and marry her, he can, because either she's not related to him at all, because the first sister was the one who needed yibum. She got yibum because she did chalitza. She's taking care of this woman. He can just marry. Or she's actually leading yivama, and it's totally fine. So therefore, if there's 2 brothers, then one can do chalitza, one can do yibum. But if they both went ahead and married anyway, well, what's the problem? The problem is that the first one actually possibly ended up marrying the sister of the one who was supposed to do yibum with, which the rabbi said is forbidden. Well, since it's only rabbinic, if you did it anyway, it's okay. And we're going to stop here with this one. So what we had today, basically, in a nutshell, was we started with 2 different interpretations of the Mishnah, and the reason for the Mishnah is come from the pasuk, which does it come with the pasuk connected with Rava. We talked about this principle of Rava. We brought 3 questions against it. If you can't do a b'zer charzeh, then even b'vat achad, it doesn't work. We brought 3 possible questions. We resolved them all. Then we said, Rava, why didn't you just say it's Kiddushin she'ein misruim l'biyah? We said, well, really, he was talking according to Rami bar Hama, but really, he could have explained the Mishnah his own way, that's Kiddushin she'ein misruim l'biyah, which isn't Kiddushin. From there, we got into this whole machlok at Rava and Abaye. Kiddushin shalom misruim l'biyah, is it Kiddushin, is it not? We brought 4 sources. We didn't get to the 5th. We'll do the 5th tomorrow. Against Rava, and we're going to see even more of them tomorrow. Sources against Rava, mishnayot, that seem to go totally against Rava, but each time we explained it's not what you thought it was. And therefore, it's not Kiddushin Shalom Surah L'Biyah, or there's a reason why it's okay here, why it actually is effective. for some other reason, not because Kiddushin Shalom and Surah L'Biyah. And with that, we resolved all the questions. That's it for today. We'll meet up tomorrow. Ma'adim L'Simcha to everyone.